place. And as you very quickly, it's a very small town. As you get out of the airport, you make your way into downtown, which is also the old town. And I put a lot of pictures, most of the pictures here actually from my cell phone. And it's just this very quaint, smallish cobblestone lined street. Many of the streets, I should say, in the old town. But like when you travel with me, some of you remember last year we were in different places in Central and Eastern Europe. I always talk about this prism through which to experience a Jewish site. It doesn't always work, but definitely in Eastern Europe. And I talk about, in this case, 700 years of Jewish life in Lithuania. I'm going to be talking about the very dark period of the Shoah, which really is shorter than in Poland. It's 41 to 45, because remember, Poland or Lithuania and Eastern Poland falls under Soviet occupation, the beginning of the Second World War, and then only in 41 does it fall under German rule, and then the complex challenge of 1945 to the present. So take off your regular glasses. You'll need a new set of lenses with which to see and to hopefully understand and appreciate this part of the world. And as I said, 700 years, like most communities we visited, good times, bad times, invited in, expelled out, times of amazing creativity and celerity, but also later on having conversation with the wider society. The very short period, I write 39 to 45, but really, after the Soviet-German Pact of Non-Aggression, things were difficult from 39 to 41, but different kettle of fish with the German occupation in 1941 until 45. And this, by the way, is the place where the Shoah, the Holocaust, actually begins. Intentional mass murder, we'll see later on today. And then finally, the questions of Jewish life. Can there be Jewish life in a city that had 100 plus synagogues and has one left? Is there anti-Semitism? What is the relationship between Lithuania and Israel today? Look at the map of where we are. I made this presentation in the fall, in November. I might have to change the map soon, because you'll see this is Russia and this is Ukraine. And this is the Donetsk region. I didn't plan on talking about this, but this is what's in the news. That is the eastern part of Ukraine. Ukraine here, the biggest country in Europe, not Russia because it's mostly in Asia, but the biggest country in Europe. But today we're talking about Lithuania, small little country, part of the three countries in the late 1990s with Poland, the Latvian countries, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, the Baltic countries, that all joined NATO. There's little Lithuania, there's Vilnius. You'll see in the maps how the country changed quite significantly in size over time, and today is a very, very, very small country. Am I here? I don't want to do that. The general tour that one takes in Vilnius begins on top of the hill of the Three Crosses, with an amazing view, and you can see very nice, centuries-old city, lots of character, and as I say, one of the great appeals to me, at least, of Vilnius, and I should say of personally, because of my four grandparents, my grandfather, my maternal grandfather came from Vilnius. I never met him. He passed away before I was born, but his brother, my uncle, was my closest male grandparent, a grandparent generation figure, and he was from Vilnius, and I feel a personal, very deep tie to Vilnius. From the top of the hill, one begins to go down, and there you see one of the major cathedrals inside of Vilnius, the cathedral / the Basilica of Stanislav and St. Ladislav, Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, depending on which church you're going into, both in this part of the world. And it is a very Christian-centric society, of course. Where are we in terms of Europe? We have been together, forget that. The area of Ashkenaz is actually here. The actual term Ashkenaz is the Rhine Valley area where these three medieval Jewish centers of Shum, Mainz, Speyer, Mainz, and Worms were located. But as a result of the Crusades in the 11th century and other persecutions, the center of Jewish life, Ashkenaz, which geographically is here, eventually migrated to Lithuania and Poland, where most of us come from, as I mentioned before. When do the Jews actually settle in Lithuania? There's no definitive answer, but probably 1,000 years ago. And it's interesting, like we've seen in other communities that we've traveled to together. It was a country where one of the kings in the 14th century invited us in as merchants, tolerated us, and then we became Servae Camere Regis. Those of you who don't know Latin, I don't, but property, literally servants of the royal chamber. He taxed us, but in return, he protected us. However, his grandson, Vladislav II, takes over after his son, And he goes in the exact opposite direction. He marries the Queen of Poland and Hungary, and the countries eventually unite, but a lot of persecution under the grandson, right? Good times, bad times. First document of our presence there, written, is from 14th century, where in Trakai, a city not too far out of Vilnius, the king granted the Jews rights, including religious autonomy. There were almost 6,000 Jews, and that 14th century document served as the basis for our status from the 14th all the way through to the 18th century. And of course, under the famous Polish king, because Poland and Lithuania were united monarchy through marriage, and things were probably best under the reign of King Casimir IV. He supposedly had a Jewish wife slash concubine slash girlfriend named Esther, but that's for another time. But eventually, his son expels the Jews. 8 years later, allows us back in for economic interests. So the classic accordion ebbing and flowing of good times and bad times in Lithuania as well. Here's the growth of the community from the year about 1000 to 1500, right? As I said, edict protecting us. This is really where Yiddish begins to grow. Jews who emigrate and flee the epicenter of the actual place, Ashkenaz in Germany, start to come in and move east, starting in the 11th century after massive persecutions in Mainz, and then later on the Crusades in 1096. And this is, as I say, where the epicenter of Ashkenazi world is. The year 1600, I put a lot of maps up here, to confuse you, but to confuse you. But the reason to confuse you is that when we use a term, let's say we say Lithuania, we look on Google and it says this is Lithuania. That's Lithuania in February 2022. It might change if things go a different way with Russia, but that's another story. But we know what the borders are. You'll see a map in a few minutes. But Lithuania at its height, this is the Kingdom of Lithuania. There is this is the Kingdom of Lithuania. And this is the kingdom, and this is Vilnius, and this is the kingdom of Poland. But they were unified. So this republic of both nations, about 500 years ago, 20 years ago exact, was the biggest country in Europe. To put it in context, and the largest concentration of Jews lived in this united monarchy, which lasted, as I say, for hundreds and hundreds of years. What did Eastern Europe look like in the year 1600? Another angle, right? This is Muscovy, not nearly as big as important as Russia later becomes under Catherine the Great and Peter the Great, end of the 18th, early 19th centuries. Sorry, early 18th to early 18th to early 19th century, the growth of Russia. Here, Poland and Lithuania, much, much larger than the Holy Roman Empire, the remnants of it, the Ottoman Empire, a very, very significant power to be reckoned with.
Mike, could you talk a little slower, please? Talk a little slower. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for pausing me. I was wondering where that beeping was coming from. Thank you, Rabbi. And as I said, when the countries were created, their union of Lublin ultimately also gave Jews limited autonomy. And for this period from 1580 to 1784, we had limited autonomy in this massive area where most of our internal issues we took care of. We had to pay tax internally, but also external tax to the crown. And as long as we paid enough, they were satisfied. And this really was this kind of golden age of Lithuanian Jewry, reaffirmed the same charter in the 17th century. And at the time, unusual for a significant community in Europe, a third of the city, 15,000 people, early 17th century in the city were Jewish. Unfortunately, later on in that century, the infamous Khmelnytsky riots coming from the south and the east devastate many of the Jewish communities. They actually get to Vilnius, and shortly thereafter, partly I think out of the trauma of this massive, we would call it a pogrom, but that's only a term later, but this massive anti-Semitic murder where maybe 100,000 Jews were murdered, there was this sense of a false messiah, which kind of reached its crescendo with Shabbatai Tzvi in the later half of the 17th century. Poland, we talked about last year, is partitioned 3 times, Poland, Lithuania, and much of what was the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth is divided and goes into Russia. And it's the first time in 4 centuries that this strongest Ashkenazi Jewish community of Poland and Lithuania is split and divided between the 2 countries. Eventually, early 19th century, Lithuania becomes part of the Pale of Settlement, and a community continues to a Jewish community continues to be quasi-autonomous even under the Tsar. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago, here is Russia. Here you can see one line, a second line, and a third line as Russia expands to the east in these three partitions in the late 18th, early 19th century. When we hear in the news as we speak today that there is a sense that Ukraine belongs to Russia, there is not just President Putin, but many Russians believe that Ukraine and Russia are inseparable, and that many of these territories were under the Tsar's rule at one time and should once again fall under Russian rule. And I think it's, even though it's not what I'm really talking about today, to contextualize the contemporary events in Russia, I think this actually is might even be a little helpful. What is the Pale of Settlement? An area into which Jews were forced to live in the late 18th century, only legally delineated in 1835 from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. So much of the area there is Kiev in the news these days a lot, right? This was Russia. All of this was under the Russian Empire, including Kielce in Poland, Warsaw over here, much of Belarusia, Minsk over here, much of Moldova of today, and of course, much of Ukraine, all falling under the Russian, and again, going all the way up to including Vilnius and Lithuania. So maps change a lot over the centuries. That's something that's very, very important to remember. In terms of what happened to Lithuania under Russian control, late 18th, early 19th century, as I mentioned, Catherine says quite clearly, "I desire no profit from the enemies of Jesus." She said the Jews didn't emigrate into Russia, rather Russia emigrated literally because of the partition of Poland and Lithuania, Belarus and Ukraine. Russia moved westward, and all of a sudden there are 1 million Jews under Catherine's control, and she doesn't like them. And in many ways, this policy of how the Tsar and the Tsarina dealt with the Jews was this ambivalent policy between harsh repression and quasi-benevolent attempts to make Jews feel a more integral part of Russian society, hopefully through assimilation, of course. Tsar Alexander I, one of the major figures in this time, he's the one who issues all sorts of statutes in the early 19th century concerning Jewish life and regulating Jewish life. Later on, his brother, I think, takes over, his son takes over, and in 1827, there's a more aggressive attempt, not just to integrate Jews into Russia, but to assimilate them forcibly. And we grew up, probably many of us, with stories of how our great-great-great-grandparents were smuggled out of the village because otherwise they'd be conscripted into the Tsar's army for 25 years. That's the period we're talking, early 19th century. As I mentioned, Nicholas I, after Alexander I, lots of Alexanders, lots of Nicholases, very confusing. I mixed them up. Ultimately, the Pale goes from the Black Sea in the south to the Baltic Sea in the north. And by the end of the 19th century, there are 5 million Jews living there. But before we go into more maps and more history, I want to introduce a debate. Now, as a Jewish audience, you know that we obviously agree on everything. That was a joke. On particularly identities. As I mentioned, I had four grandparents from Poland, Ukraine, Russia, and Lithuania. And differences of opinion, of course. And the biggest difference of opinion, and in many of your families as well, was between the Lithuanians, the Litvaks, and the Galicianers. Now, Galicia is a geographic area where the Hasidic revolution begins in the late 18th century, led by this guy, Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, also known as the Besht, or the Baal Shem Tov, who founded Hasidic mystical Judaism. On the other hand, in this corner, weighing in at the Baal Shem Tov, Eliyahu ben Shlomo Zalman, not the Baal Shem Tov, the Vilna Gaon, the sage of Vilna, late 18th century as well, who was a very staunch opponent to the emergence of Hasidism. And so even to this day, in the world of ultra-Orthodoxy, there is a big division between the Lithuanians, the Litvaks, and the Galicianers. How do you know who is who? It's time for the great Litvak-Galicianer face-off. Litvaks and Lithuanians, and I don't want to disclose too many of you, because you might be some secret Lithuanians, but Litvaks generally, on Friday night Kiddush, sit down. Litvaks, when they pray, they stand solid. They barely move their lips while they're praying. You'll see how the Galicianers, the Hasidim, do it. They're much more rational, logical, dogmatic, and authoritarian. I've been called Litvak more than Galicianer, you should know. They're more logical and intellectual. I've been called Lithuanian or Litvak. They eat salty food, especially gefilte fish, right? How do you know? Oh, you give a person 2 pieces of gefilte fish. One salty, ugh, it's horrible. They're Galicianers. One sweet, it's horrible. They're Litvaks. Very different way of eating their food. And of course, they're opposed to the revolution within Judaism of Hasidism by the followers, by the Baal Shem Tov and his followers. What about the Galicianers? Galicianers, generally, in contradistinction to the Litvaks, they stand during the Friday night Kiddush. They move as much as they possibly can, shuckling backwards and forwards when they're davening. They're much more emotional and spiritual, less logical and intellectual, much more engaged in tradition, and much of their diet is sweet. The kugel has got raisins in it, lots of cinnamon and lots of sugar. Now, I don't know what household many of you grew up in, but you can probably figure out where the predominant, role model in your family came from based on many of these traditions. Now, it's interesting because there was a time where Galicianers and Litvaks had nothing to do with each other, and they never would marry, and they would never socialize. What are the areas? So again, a Litvak is a Lithuanian, and the Lithuanian is Lithuania. The Galicianers is a geographic term. Galicia, at various points, all of the yellow and all of the orange and all of the blue, all the colors were part of Galicia. But it's an area from Krakow eastward and southward. So it involves Tarnopol, lots of the Ukraine of today, Belarusia of today, Eastern Poland of today, but not Warsaw. And it's this area where charismatic rebbes grew up and had courts in a lot of these communities in this part of the world, kind of also going down to Hungary and Slovakia as well. So big geographic difference, but even more than that, a kind of philosophical approach to human existence. Now, when Jews came to America, late 19th, early 20th century, there were you're different communities. You wouldn't associate if you were a Litvak with someone who was a Galicianer. And so when I was putting this thing together, I discovered from what does it say? Can't even see the date. It says 1911, this Jewish musical that was put together in Yiddish is Litvak and Galicianer. Hey, don't talk about our differences. We're Jews. We're all, moving here together. Let's great and let's celebrate our commonality rather than our differences as Litvaks and Galicianers. When putting this together online through the Jewish Yiddish Institute founded in Vilnius, YIVO, which is today centered in New York, they describe the traits of Litvaks. And I got into a lot of trouble, by the way, because I thought this was funny. Again, I think I identify much more as a Litvak than a Galicianer. I like peanuts more than I like chocolate. I'm more rational and maybe less emotional. That's, if you were to ask my wife, and I'm not going to let you ask her, she'd probably say more of a Litvak. And for my family, that's kind of the predominant tradition that we had. But listen to how the Yiddish Institute describes it. Litvaks were commonly portrayed in Jewish folklore as cold, calculating, lacking in emotional depth, overly rational, skeptical, and prone to heretical thinking, all in contradistinction to their warmer, more emotive, naive, and pious Jewish co-religionists to the south. The most common stereotypical contrast between them is between Litvaks and Galicianers, who are viewed as polar opposites in their emotions, intellectual sensibilities, speech, food, dress, and religious demeanor. So I sent this to a friend of mine who was clearly a Litvak in my eyes, and he was upset at me. He said, what are you talking about? How can you say that? And, with a classic intellectual approach, rather than an emotional approach, I said, you've just proven that you're more of a Litvak than a Galicianer, right? Unemotional, withdrawn, intellectual, mercilessly critical, etc. The best way to discover the distinction, as I said, is through the food. Litvaks prepare the food with salt and pepper, Galicianers with sugar or cinnamon. And the best line, Galicianer's gut is too big, but he has a small head. The Litvak's gut is too small, but he has a big head. The moral of the story is to have a reasonable size gut and a reasonable size head. But for those of you old enough to remember the difference between them and how people didn't want to associate Litvaks and Galicianers, today we're doing the Litvak story. Napoleon comes to Vilnius, early 19th century, and he is the one who coins the term Jerusalem of Lithuania. Now, if a conqueror comes and sees what's happening and describes it in such language, it really gives you a sense of the significance of the Jewish community in Vilnius, in Lithuania. This, by the way, is Vilnius today, and I love this map. This area over here is the area in this line of modern day Lithuania. This was it at its height. Remember, in the 16th century, all of the green and all the purple and everything over here. So it's gone through lots and lots of changes over the centuries. A couple more on the history. Here we see the great Tsar from a Jewish point of view, Alexander II, who is seen as the Tsar liberator. In Russian context, he abolishes serfdom. And from our point of view, he loosens control on us, allowing us for the first time to move into the big cities of St. Petersburg and Moscow. There's a growth, look at the numbers, from 1820, for 1.4, three-time growth of the population in 60 years. Unfortunately, he's assassinated. It leads to a wave of anti-Semitism. And of course, we are blamed, not for the anti-Semitism, although some might do that, but we're blamed for the murder of the Tsar. And unfortunately, his son takes over, and his son issues, Alexander III, oppressive laws against the Jews, which ultimately leads, is the death knell, really, of Jewish life in the Pale of Settlement, because it leads to an emigration of somewhere between 2 to 2.5 million Jews to North America from 1880 until the First World War, and 70,000 Jews to Palestine. This emigration ultimately is the backbone of contemporary North American and Israeli Jewry. Fascinating story. Things going well, things going bad, things going well, like most of the communities we visited together. Here is an image of Tsar Alexander being murdered in St. Petersburg. Today, there is a church, beautiful church in St. Petersburg, the Church of Spilt Blood, built over the place of the assassination of the Tsar. Into the Jewish story a little bit deeper, once we've put some of the older history behind us. The Vilna Gaon, there's his time, there's what he looks like, not like Karl Marx, I should say. Vilna Gaon was a fascinating figure. He was an amazing Talmudist, a rabbinic authority on rabbinic law, a mystic as well. And he really was, for probably in the past 300 years, the greatest leader of the Jewish stream opposed to Hasidism. When he was 6, he gave his first sermon. And keep in mind, they didn't have iPads to read from, right? It was from memory. He never had an official title outside of his rabbinic ordination, but he was the leader, not but the leader of Ashkenazi Jewry. And in many ways, he wanted to return, or he emphasized the importance of returning to the basics, studying the Torah, then the prophets, and then the Talmud, making sure one had a perfect command of Hebrew, both in terms of language and syntax, also involved in understanding science. And he was very much the mentor of what later became a movement called Musar, focusing on morality and ethics, how we lead our lives, how we perfect our character. And was a very kind of tough, inflexible, and uncompromising kind of guy. And once this kind of revolt against mainstream Judaism begins, in Galicia, in the southern part, south of like in the map that I showed you before, in Poland, in southern Poland, he excommunicates the Vilna Gaon, the followers of Hasidism, after they open a little shtibel, a little synagogue in Vilnius in the 18th century. That's me. See a similarity. And there is the statue of what used to be the synagogue of Vilna Gaon. It's actually a former communist statue. It's an image of Karl Marx. There is a sign. You'll notice it's written in Lithuanian and in Yiddish, nothing in Hebrew whatsoever. And most of the signs, nothing in English in most of these signs as well. And to describe maybe one of his teachings in a book written by probably 10 or 15 years ago by an American rabbi, Moshe Zariel. So it's about a commentary of the Vilna Gaon on Proverbs, Mishle, and the proverb is, better a dry crust with peace than a house full of fasting with strife. A good lesson for not just the 18th century, but for today as well. What's his commentary on that? The rabbi, Vilna Gaon. Better it is to learn a little and calmly, and for the sake of the mitzvah, the commandment of learning, and to continually review, than to learn much with strife and for the sake of quarreling. That's why Rabbi cuts me off every once in a while and says, Mike, slow down, because she's saying it's better to learn a little and calmly and slowly for the sake of learning than it is to learn with strife. Now, nobody's arguing with me because it's a webinar, but again, understanding the importance of understanding the basics, that's the perspective of the Vilna Gaon. Go back to the basics, and only then can you go into the deeper stages of understanding. Now, where the center of the Jewish life was an area called the Schulhof, And here's a picture of it, early 20th century. And in the Schulhof was the place where, even before he was there, he wasn't born in Vilna, he came to Vilna, but even before he was there was a synagogue built out of stone in the 17th century, replacing an earlier wooden structure. And by the time he's on the scene in the late 18th, early 19th century, it becomes the center of religious, social, cultural, administrative activities in a context with the same, adjacent to the synagogue. And there was this kind of protected courtyard. This is the building of the synagogue here. There was a protected courtyard that really became the center of Jewish communal life in Vilnius. Here's a picture in the 1920s of it. There's the synagogue. This is the Strashun Library, which we'll talk about later and moves to a later area. And this is it damaged after the Second World War. This pillar over here, can you see, was this thing over here. Go back one picture. You see the gate with the two pillars on both sides and the lights, right? Put that in context. This is one of the pillars on the right, and this is what's left of that gate at the end of the Second World War. Heavily damaged. And unfortunately, after the war, the Soviet regime built a children's school on the site of the synagogue. And right next to it is a bust of the Vilna Gaon. Again, it's not really him, it's Karl Marx, but it doesn't matter. But you saw that picture previously. I just wanted to show you what was there until not that long ago. And in the 1990s, it became a World Heritage Site. It is in the midst, as we speak, of being excavated. And you'll see here, there's a sign outside of it. And the first time I went, probably 5 years ago there, you could see the UNESCO World Heritage Site, Israel Antiquities Authority, City of Vilnius, all excavating and finding remnants of what was there. The first time I walked there, I could see they found remnants of a floor that actually led down to a bathhouse. There was a mikveh there as well. But you'll see in the following pictures, when I was there maybe 3.5 years ago, with John Seligman, the Israeli archaeologist who was excavating. We went into the school. This is the building from the 1950s, the bricks over here and the concrete. And they had started to excavate. The school is no longer, the school doesn't function as a school today. And they found this, which they thought was part of the bima of the synagogue of the Gra, of the Vilna Gaon. This is a later picture of what the first one I showed you of this underground entrance into a bathhouse. It's amazing that Israeli and Lithuanian archaeologists are excavating perhaps the most important synagogue and community complex in Eastern Europe. Here's a picture before 1940, of course, of the beautiful bima. And I put this one here, which I found online, because you'll see, notice this kind of niche down below the bima and the stairs on both sides. And you'll notice the stairs on the right and the stairs on the left, the 1950s concrete foundation of the Soviet synagogue. And you notice this? It is this. This floor is this floor. And notice the beautiful tile on the floor. More and more in the pictures you'll see of the synagogue are actually being uncovered. And here is a quote by John Seligman, the archaeologist, Israeli archaeologist. When we arrived to, who's by the way originally a Litvak, grew up in South Africa, Lithuanian grandparents, now he's in Israel. When we arrived to excavate the Ark, the Aron Kodesh and the Bima, from which generations of Jews read the Torah scroll for 300 consecutive years, it became clear, unfortunately, that the core of the synagogue had been greatly damaged by Soviet destruction. Still, two impressive staircases, the one on the right and the left, visible in the many images of the synagogue before its destruction, here, were discovered and are evidence of their existence. Phenomenal stuff. Look at how much clearer it gets. Again, the 1950s communist wall and the foundation leading up. Here's a staircase over here, not yet uncovered, staircase over here. And this was the bima that we saw in the previous image. So much was damaged, but the Soviets didn't excavate it, they just leveled it and built on top of it. A yad was discovered. Keep in mind, a yad may be passed down through generations. The Jews used to read Torah in the same synagogue that the Vilna Gaon himself was teaching in centuries before. This is a map of all of Vilnius, Vilna in English. And if you look, this is the Jewish quarter, historic Jewish quarter. Where is it in the city? This is the hill where we started our journey a while ago, the Hill of the Three Crosses. This is where the cathedral is down there. This is where the university is. And look where this is the Jewish center here. And look where it fits into the city. Smack in the center, literally a block away. This is City Hall. in the city, and this was the main Jewish quarter. So an integral part of the city, a central part of the city, again, huge numbers of Jews living there, and from a third to almost half at various times. One of the most important institutions in Vilnius, whose significance extended way beyond that of Lithuania, was a publishing house called the Widow Rom and Sons Publishing House. They, from these years here, published one of the few Jewish published houses allowed in Tsarist Russia. If you open a Talmud today to study a Talmud, it'll say on the first page, this is based on the edition of Widow Rom and Sons. And when I first went there, I wanted to visit the place, and I was disappointed that it didn't exist. My colleague Daniel, Lithuanian Israeli, who lives there and accompanies our groups when we go, took me to this building. He said, "Why do you want to go?" I said, "Well, because my mother's maiden name is Rome, R-O-M-E. And my late uncle always used to tell us the story that he thought that Rome and Rom, were also from Lithuania, were related, but he could never find a smoking gun connecting us to that family. But I feel a personal connection there. And here you can see the Talmud, right? The Masech, the Rosh Hashanah from the Babylonian Talmud. And there in Hebrew it says, B'dfus v'otzaat almanat v'achim Rome. Printed by the printing house of Widow Rom and Sons. Some of the dilapidated buildings, basically a square block of the printing house. But again, I put these pictures up to give you a sense of what it looks like today. Very different than in Prague, if you've been with me virtually or directly there. You kind of still get this sense of, with the cobblestone streets that cars drive on, by the way, that much of the city still looks like it's back hundreds of years ago. At the same time, part of that long building is a very modern building here, an earlier building from the 70s or 80s as well, all sitting on the place where the Widow Rom and Sons Publishing House. Turn of the late 19th, early 20th century was possibly the most important time in the Jewish community outside of maybe the period of the Vilna Gaon. And listen to, this is actually taken from Lucy Davidovitz, if I'm not mistaken, who went to work with the YIVO Institute just before the war broke out in 1939. At the end of the 19th century, Vilnius was a center of political activity in Hebrew and Yiddish literature. There was an art school in which Jews didn't have a quota. Some great Jews, including Boris Schatz, who eventually opens the first school of art and design in Jerusalem, Betzalel, in 1906. The Bund, a secular Jewish political party, was founded in 1897 there. And in 1901, half of the city, 76,000 were Jews, and it had over 100 big and small synagogues, hundreds of educational Jewish institutions. Look at the numbers, 13,000 Jews studied there, lots of educational institutions. But at the end of the First World War, in the middle of the First World War, Germany took Vilnius. At the end of 1918, they retreated. For 2 years, Poland, Russia, and Lithuania argued over who controlled the city. Versailles in 1919 gave Vilnius to the new state of Lithuania. But the Poles in October of 20 occupied Vilnius, and it continued to be part of Poland until 1939. Crazy story. Talk about maps changing. And this is, again, the context in what's happening as we speak today between Russia and Ukraine. 100,000 Jews, almost half of the population, by the outbreak of the Second World War. Besides the Bund, the Marxist Party, Jewish Socialist Party in 1897, perhaps the most important institution formed was the YIVO Institute, founded in the 1920s as an institute for research of Yiddish history, culture, etc. And its idea was to collect as much and document as much of Jewish life and folklore and history around Eastern Europe. And they had all sorts of conferences. And it really was one of the first Jewish educational institutions. You might have seen last year with me the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw as well, but really focusing on understanding Jewish history, collecting 100,000 volumes by the beginning of the First World War. Very, very big. Unfortunately, the Germans took a lot of it. Much of it was captured and eventually made its way somehow to the United States, which became the center in New York of YIVO by 1940. Look at Vilnius as the Second World War breaks out. This is from the Yad Vashem website in Jerusalem, the spiritual center of East European Jewry, the center of enlightenment and Jewish political life, of Jewish creativity and the experience of daily Jewish life, a community bursting with cultural and religious life, movements, parties, educational institutions, libraries, theaters, rabbis, a spiritual center of the first world, of the first order. One of the most, if not the most significant Jewish communities on the eve of the Second World War. And as Lucy Davidovich describes, American comes to Europe to study in the Evo, a new kind of Jewish culture emerged, characterized by the fertilizing interplay of opposites, the old and the new, secular, religious, Zionist and non-Zionist, where Yiddish and Hebrew competed with each other, as well as with a Polish Jewish writing in Poland. High culture, low culture, a feverish flowering in the shadow of death. This is 1939, literally in the eve of the outbreak of the Second World War. And I know most people don't make it to Vilnius. I've only been there 3 times, maybe, with groups now. 3 times. And I've been to Poland dozens of times. It's a little bit harder to get to, but I really think that as you walk the streets of Vilnius, you can see these alleyways and the cobblestone. You can see there's a Jewish museum, the Museum of Tolerance. You see all sorts of Jewish signs in Hebrew and Yiddish. This is where Theodor Herzl spoke to the Committee of Rabbis, for example. This sign says when he visited in 1903. And there are some visible remnants of Jewish life pre-1939. Here you can see Yiddish and Lithuanian. Sklep is a store, right? A Jewish family store. And across the street from that building is this building, which is a very important institution, the Strashun Library, which I'll come back to. There's another image of it. It's Jewish property. There aren't that many Jews who are there today. There is the sign that tells you that this was the library up until the Second World War. Interesting story about an individual, a rabbi, whose father, Matityahu's father, Samuel, starts collecting books. He's a rabbi, he's an intellectual, a maskil, he's a philanthropist, and he collects all of these books, thousands and thousands of them over centuries, that age over centuries. By 1931, it's his private collection, over 33,000 titles. They decide to move it into this building. As I said, 40,000 items ultimately were found after the war in a train by the US Army that the Nazis were going to use, and is eventually shipped and today housed in the YIVO Institute. There was just an article last week, actually, in Tablet magazine online, Google it afterwards, and it describes the Strashun collection and its importance and how it's now digitized and one can have access. I haven't tried yet, but it's now digitized and you can access it anywhere. World War II begins, practice of non-aggression. The Soviets occupy what is Vilnius, and in 1941, the Germans occupy, head east, Operation Barbarossa. They occupy Vilnius. They set up a ghetto in September of 41, and by October they had 2 ghettos, a large and a small ghetto. Here you can see the wooden fence, right? Not like the Warsaw brick wall that was built immediately upon arrival, right? In Warsaw, it takes 2 years for the ghetto to be, a year, September 39 to November 40, till the ghetto is built. The wall is built. Here, the ghetto is built immediately. 40,000 Jews, but by the end of that year, 3 months, almost all the Jews are already murdered in a killing field in a place called Ponar, we'll visit in a few minutes, just outside the city of Vilnius. They close down the large ghetto, and they have a small ghetto with only 14,000 prisoners, who are essentially slave laborers serving the German occupiers. By the September of 43, they liquidate the ghetto, and they send 2,000 Jews to work at various jobs in Vilnius, but there's no longer a ghetto. But there is an underground in Vilnius. 150 members managed to escape and join the partisans in the forest, and some of them were involved in liberating Majdanek, the concentration camp in Poland, and Vilnius in the summer of 1944. So again, a wall built out of wood, much later, much quicker than in Poland. And again, of the 76,000 Jews before the war, 2,000 to 3,000 survived by 1945. Some images of the ghettos. This is the small ghetto, this is the large ghetto, but a very, very short period in which the ghettos actually survived. This is today one of the nicer streets in the old town of Vilnius. It was one of the main streets historically in the Jewish neighborhood and was part of the small ghetto. There you can see it says in Yiddish and in Lithuanian, Rehova Yehudim, the street of the Jews, Yiddish Gas, right? The Gasse, the Judengasse in German. And today, as I said, a nice address, former houses in the Jewish neighborhood. This is an embassy. I don't remember what country. I think it's the Austrian embassy in former Jewish property. Take it. a brief break. I hope the video isn't too choppy because my Wi-Fi doesn't seem to be as strong as it usually is. So a brief movie, a minute and a half to kind of get a more visual understanding of this amazing Jerusalem of Lithuania, what it was, and how quickly it ended. So a city, 76,000 Jews beforehand, 2,000 survive, and you saw the numbers somewhere around 200,000 Lithuanian Jews. Lithuania is perhaps the community that is most, in terms of a percentage, most devastated by the Holocaust. Here you see a group of Jews, partisans, fighting in the forest, the most famous of whom is Abba Kovner, up over here, who survives, comes to Israel, becomes an intellectual, a poet, a very important figure. And he, on New Year's Eve, makes a speech. What is it, the exact date? On New Year's Eve, 1941, 1942, he gives a speech to Jewish youth. He is really the first person to recognize what is going on inside Lithuania. Incredulous, by the way. He actually, 20 years later, testifying at the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, says, how could I come to this realization? How could I make this decision? Crazy. And he says the following: Jewish youth, do not place your trust in those who deceive you. Of the 80,000 Jews in Jerusalem of Lithuania, only 20,000 are left. Before our eyes, our parents, brothers, and sisters were torn from us. Where are the hundreds of men who were seized for labor by the Lithuanian kidnappers? Where are the naked women? And where are our brothers from the ghetto? No one returned of those marched through the gates. All roads of the Gestapo lead to Ponar, and Ponar means death. Those who waver put aside all illusion. Your children, your wives, and husbands are no more. Ponar is no concentration camp. They were all shot there. Hitler aims to destroy all the Jews of Europe. It is the lot of the Jews of Lithuania to be the first in line. Let us not go, listen to his phrase, like sheep to the slaughter. True, we are weak and without a protector, but only the only answer to the murder is revolt. Brothers, better to fall as free fighters than to live at the mercy of murderers. And he, together with his band of 150, makes this announcement and says, let us revolt. We shall fight until our last breath. He survives. Majority of them do not survive. It's a minority response. Once the small ghetto over here is closed, right? Only this one is left from September 41. It's December 41, New Year's Eve, where he makes his declaration. And he realizes, and they realize, and they escape, manage to escape, and as I say, fight back. But the first, probably, of the major revolts, the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt, remember, is April 1943. That was a memorial to the uprising. And here you can see one of the concrete bunkers. I went once with a group outside of Vilnius to see some of the concrete bunkers that these young men and young women, Jews who joined non-Jews as well, hid in the forest, all sorts of attempted retributions against the Nazis, but more than anything else survived. Think of the Bielski brothers, the story, the movie in the book Defiance, who lived in the, I think they lived in, not in Lithuania, but I'm pretty sure they're in Belarus. In 1941, the mass murder of Jews begins on Lithuanian soil. We think between 1.5 and 2 million Jews were killed. In a term used by the French Catholic priest, Father Patrick Dubois, who in his book, The Holocaust by Bullets, this is where the Germans go from town to town, village to village. They round up the Jews, take them out of town, they shoot them, they dig a pit, shoot them, and murder them. And when I went a few years ago with a group from Milwaukee, we went actually with Father Dubois. There he is. He met us. He was doing research with his team. And he took us to a house of this man who was a young child in 1941. And his family and the neighboring farming family had two Jewish families who were working for them since the Soviet occupation in 1941, forced labor. And when the Germans came and they said, okay, we're rounding up the Jews, everyone has to come to the square. They said, we're not going anywhere. I said, bring your Jewish families. They brought the two Jewish families. This man told us in a shaking voice, he's in his 80s now. And he said, and then the Germans shot them on the spot. And then my father, the man said, ask the Germans, what should we do with them? And he said, well, they're your Jews. Do what you want. And they buried them in a field across the farm. We went and we said Kaddish, the first time since 1940, since ever, that any Jewish group said Kaddish over the graves of these 10 Jews who, like tens of thousands of others in that little area where we were in Lithuania, were murdered. The majority of Lithuanian Jews, however, were murdered here at Ponar, Panieri in Lithuania. And Ponar, you can see loads and loads. Don't read the text, it's too small. I just want you to see different signs in different languages over different time, which illustrate the transition and the change in memorial structures and memorial commemoration art in Eastern Europe. First built by the communists, everything was about anti-fascism. This is what the National Socialist fascists did. Later on, post-Glasnost, things changed a lot. Hebrew, English, etc. And in this place of Ponar, 100,000 people, 70% were Jews, were murdered between July 41 and 1944. Many were from Vilnius, many walked actually, and they were shot into these pits. They had been Soviet kind of pits designed to store oil, never used though. And they were kept in the pit at night. And some of them had to exhume the bodies and burn them the next day. Eventually, some of the prisoners dug a 35-foot long tunnel, and 40 of them escaped. When the Germans discovered what happened, they captured them. 11 managed to escape and join the partisans and they told the story later. They recently, 5-7 years ago, discovered that tunnel in one of these pits. Here you can say it's a memorial. It's this pit actually, and often one of the sides is out of cover now, but the pit is the 35-foot long. So the Jews were in here and they couldn't get out at night. They were under guard. And then somehow they managed to dig this 35-foot long tunnel. Once it was discovered, they then handcuffed all the Jewish prisoners who were there doing the dirty work, right? Removing the bodies, cremating them on behalf of the German murderers. And they handcuffed them so they couldn't escape afterwards. Crazy, crazy story. But not only were we able to go, have I been to Ponar a few times, but also to the site where the man showed us. There you're driving along the highway, 0.3 kilometers. There is the site of mass murder. You're getting closer, 200 meters. There is the man telling the story in front of this memorial structure, where in one day in the summer, fall of 1941, the entire Jewish community, I don't even remember the name of the town, was essentially, almost all of it was wiped out, and there's this little marker in the forest. And Father Dubois and his team of volunteers in Eastern Europe is going from place to place to place and trying to figure out how many Jews, what day, and ultimately how many people were murdered in this horrible Holocaust by bullets. And Dubois, is suggesting that up to 2 million, not just 1.5, but up to 2 million Jews were killed in this horrible fashion. You know the story of Babi Yar in October of 1941, just celebrated the 80th anniversary. 33,771 Jews are killed in 2 days in October of 19. So you take that number, multiply by hundreds and hundreds. And of course, as you go throughout this part, you'll see loads of remnants of Jewish communities. All that are left are scattered and destroyed cemeteries, including this one on a hill, not too far from where we were. And here you can see in Hebrew, it says, Ponit man, here is buried, Ha'isha Hatsnua, the modest woman, the matriarch of the family. People buried her a century plus ago. Unfortunately, they said Kaddish. Unfortunately, there's not much left of the family and nobody really to come and say Kaddish anymore. In the context of all of this, though, and I see my clock, I want to take another eight minutes or so and then leave some time for questions, is this notion of the righteous amongst the nations, right? The non-Jews who risked their life in order to save Jews. Perhaps the most famous story in Lithuania is that of the Japanese consul who was in Kaunas, second biggest city in Lithuania, just north of Vilnius. He issued as many as 6,000 family visas, so 6,000 times 4 or 5 in a family, defying his government's orders. They quickly dismissed him, and his university, not his government, but his university that he went to, there it is, Waseda University, in 1985, put this one then, and this memorial, in 2001, the university made this memorial. Yad Vashem honored him as a righteous amongst the nations in 1985. But as I was presenting this, putting this together, his son was coming to Jerusalem, and you'll see that in a couple slides. Here's a picture, and I'll tell you the close, kind of the wrap-up story is that. Here is Sugiharah in his in the foreign ministry. He was basically, shortly he was sent back to Japan, and then he was kind of shunned aside because he didn't follow orders of his superiors and did what he thought was right. But listen to what he wrote in 1985, recognized by Yad Vashem. You want to talk about my motivation? Well, it's the kind of sentiments anyone would have when he sees refugees face to face, begging with tears in their eyes. He just cannot help but sympathize with them. Yes, I actually witnessed such scenes with my own eyes. Also, I felt at the time the Japanese government didn't have any uniform opinion. Some Japanese military leaders were just scared because of the pressure from the Nazis, while others were ambivalent. People in Tokyo were not united. I felt it was silly to deal with them. I knew that somebody would surely complain about me in the future, but the key, I myself thought this would be the right thing to do. Simple as that. And he saved tens of thousands of Jews. There is nothing wrong in saving many people's lives. The spirit of humanity, philanthropy, neighborly friendship. With this spirit, I ventured to do what I did, confronting this most difficult situation. Because of this reason, I went ahead with redoubled courage. This is in the biography of Sugiharah in the late 1990s. Other righteous, I'm not going to bother with this story, too many stories. In Vilnius, there are 3 Jewish cemeteries. One there's no remnant of. This was a cemetery. The stones were destroyed in order to build a new sports complex, and they built a memorial out of the matzevot, out of the tombstones. And here's a close-up of that. It's a crazy story of just destruction of the Second World War, Soviet really not caring about anything except putting up memorials to talk about the evils of the fascist crimes. But in Vilnius today, the small Jewish community, less than a handful of thousand of Jews, there is one synagogue built a little over 100 years ago, the only one that survived the Holocaust and, I should say, Soviet rule. Quite small, beautiful, cute little synagogue, a choral synagogue, because up here, over here, was a place where the choir would sit. It functions today. It actually functioned during communism as well. It's quite small, but quite a colorful synagogue as we speak. There's also Chabad, a small ultra-Orthodox community there, even though the Vilna Gaon didn't want them there, but they're there today. And here you can see, built in 1903, the facade, beautiful structure. I think your synagogue might be contemporaneous to this, actually, the original campus of Wilshire Boulevard. A couple themes before I open up to questions. Is a Lithuanian non-Jew, Ruta Vanagete, together with Ephraim Zurov, the head of the Wiesenthal Center in Jerusalem, wrote this book, Discovering Lithuania's Hidden Secrets. When she discovered how much of her parents' and grandparents' generation, significant numbers of Lithuanians, were willing executioners helping Hitler carry out the crime on Lithuanian soil. She was blacklisted when she put out this book. She spoke to one of the groups I had guided there. Very troublesome. There's still streets in Vilnius that are named after some serious Lithuanian leaders who cooperated with the Nazis. It's quite a problematic / challenging legacy. Here is the sports complex that was built over that cemetery, whose tombstones were removed. You saw a few pictures ago. And just in August of last year, finally, thankfully, the government scrapped the plan to build a new conference center. So this is where the cemetery where the Vilna Gaon was buried. Not much is left except those tombstones. They want to take it down and build another one. If you're going to take it down, maybe you should actually put what was there originally, the Jewish cemetery. Here's the story of Sugiharah, and it's interesting that when I was putting this together, this is in, today, so whatever, this was in October, if I'm not mistaken, the son of Sugiharah was coming to Israel to participate in a ceremony in honor of his father, a square named after him in a neighborhood in Jerusalem. And he was denied entry because of some crazy COVID bureaucracy. It was cleared up very, very quickly. But here you see pictures of outside the father's consulate in Kaunas in 41, 42, Jews waiting for visas. There was the son, his, I want to say his wife, daughter, whatever, family, maybe not. And here you can see the square in Jerusalem. And listen to the son describing in October what his dad did. My father came to visit me. He was studying, the son, in Jerusalem in 1969. I asked my father, how many do you think you saved? He didn't like to hear saved. He just did what he could do. He thought if 2 or 3 people could survive, then it's a miracle. But the real miracle, he didn't know. A few 100,000 survivors. Descendants are all over the world, many, many in Israel. Now, a few 100,000, seriously? Look, if he issued 6,000 visas, family visas, my family's 5, I don't know how many in each of your families, but if he saved 30,000 Jews in 1941, those 30,000, 80 years later, 90 years later, are many hundreds of thousands of people alive. Why? Because he did what he thought was the right thing, even if he was going against the very bizarre and very conservative rules and regulations of the Japanese foreign ministry. I will end with my favorite line when I take people virtually, or hopefully soon, really, around Central and Eastern Europe. It is complicated. 1991, Lithuania, the first independent state from the Soviet Union, not Poland, right? Poland was out of the joined NATO, but was out of the Soviet influence, but it was always a independent state. But Lithuania was part of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union falls apart, it becomes one with Lithuania, with Latvia and Estonia, the 3 Baltic countries, first independent country after the Soviet Union. They created a national memorial day for the genocide of victims of Lithuanian Jews every September, marking the day of the liquidation of the Vilna ghetto in memory and commemoration of 95% of the community that was destroyed, more than any other country. The parliament declared that 2 years ago was the year of the Vilna Gaon and Lithuanian Jews. And as the Minister of Culture says, the tragedy of Lithuania, non-Jew, the tragedy of the Jewish people is the tragedy of Lithuania. The state lost hundreds of thousands of its citizens to the fires of the Holocaust. The Jews contributed, she continued, to the creation of the Lithuanian state and deeply affected all areas of life, enriching it with their unique cultural heritage. Together with all of you, I bow my head to remember the victims of the Lithuanian Jewish genocide and believe that today we are strong and united enough to prevent such tragedies from happening again. Unfortunately, there are still lots of people in Lithuania who want to honor Lithuanians who fought with the Nazis and were willing executioners together with the Nazis in the dark but short period of 1941 to 1945. So like all our visits, we celebrate the richness of Jewish life over 700 years in Vilnius. We grapple with the complex challenges of how do you survive, the minority response of the underground and the revolt led by Abba Kovner and 150 of his comrades. And we grapple with a very small community of 2,000 to 3,000 people with lots of financial assets of the communal property and individual property that the Lithuanian government has given to the small Jewish community, and deal with the challenges in Lithuania today of trying to figure out how they can come to grips with the fact that there were Lithuanians who were very involved in the murder of Jews, but yet there were also Lithuanians who are recognized as righteous amongst the nations. And with that, I turn it over to you, Rabbi, to see if we have any questions.
Thank you. I wanted to say that I now realize that on my father's side, they were Litvaks because everything was salty. And my mother's side, they were Galicianos because everything was sweet.
How did they ever marry? How did they marry? You know,
well, I know when my grandmother married my Russian grandfather, the family was all up in arms about it. They didn't want him to marry her. So it must have been there too. But before we go to the questions, I wanted to know if you know about this new book called When I Grow Up. It is by, it's the lost autobiographies of 6 Yiddish teenagers from Lithuania. So this New Yorker cartoonist, Ken Crimstein, he's coming to the temple around Yom HaShoah to talk about this book, found out that in a basement of a Lithuanian church, we're talking about last year, they found hundreds of essays from a contest by YIVO to ask Yiddish teenagers in Yiddish to write their autobiographies for a contest. And the prize is going to be announced on September 1st, 1939, which it did not obviously happen. And what he did is he made a graphic book of 6 of the stories. So you see that
Ken Crimstein?
Yes. And it's a beautiful book. I read it in one day, and it's like you hear the dreams and hopes, but he did it in a graphic novel. If you look up for, do you see, Mike, what I have here, the graphic novel? So it's like it's like a cartoonist version. It's graphic, but it's all the heart, it's a love story, all these different stories and hopes and dreams of these. He picked 6 to tell their stories. And he went to Lithuania, he took them, he read them, I guess he knows Yiddish, or he had them translated. And he calls where they come from Yiddishuania. He named it Yiddishuania, wow. But they're from Lithuania. So I just wanted to let everybody and you know about this book that you might find interesting.
I put it on my phone. I'm Googling it right now. I see that somebody else referred to what in the chat, this was Paula, she wrote in the chat that YIVO was founded, as I said, in Vilnius, 25. Do I know that it recently completed the collection project to preserve, digitize, and virtually reunite it? Yes, that's what I said. Google it. It's there. There's an article in Tablet magazine. Definitely, I mean, I don't know how much research you all want to do in your free time, but it's definitely fascinating. And I'm going to now find this book, Rabbi, When I Grow Up. I'm not going to find the book when I grow up. I'm already grown up. I'm saying, but I want to find the book, quote, underline, italics, when I grow up, to learn more about it. Somebody mentioned Corey Tenboom in the chat. I see, Rabbi.
Yeah.
She's a story connected to Amsterdam and the hiding place. Are we going to Amsterdam together?
Yes, next week, I think.
I'm talking about her, so don't tell anybody. I'm going to talk about Corey Tenboom, whoever asked me that question. Yes.
Okay, yeah, somebody mentioned that the collection is digitized. And what else? Are we planning a trip? We're going to find out. We're planning a trip in 2023 to some countries in Europe is what we're planning. And hold on, let me see if I have anything else. Oh, there are, the Ukraine. I guess some people are interested in the Ukraine in the Holocaust, but I know the Ukrainians were very collaborative with the Nazis, and most of the Jews died.
There were those, as I say, Rabbi, there were those and there were those. I mean, we say the same about Poland. The Poles were collaborative. Look, Poland was different because Poland suffered a lot under the Nazis. 3 million non-Jewish Poles were killed. 3 million Jews were killed. And there was a significant Polish uprising, huge numbers of Polish righteous amongst the nation. But I was at Yad Vashem today for the first time in 2 years of the group of Congress people. And I said to them, on the way in, there are 25, I think 26 now, 1,000 righteous amongst the nations. Sugihara alone, 6,000. Schindler, 1,200. Corey Tenboom, hundreds we'll find next week in Amsterdam. And yet 25,000 is a large number. But what if there would have been 250,000?
Exactly.
2.5 people.
Yeah.
We would not be having this conversation. So you could say that it's good that there were that many people who stood up to do the right thing in the shadow of the worst crime ever perpetrated by man against man. But on the other hand, it's a very small drop in the ocean of all the people who were there.
Well, thank you. I started out laughing a lot when you were telling all the stories about there's a beautiful story by Yud Lamed Peretz.
Yud Lamed Peretz?
Called,
yeah, if not higher.
If not higher, about how Litvak, spies on a Hasidic Rebbe because they all say that he goes to heaven during the Slichot time, and he follows him and he finds out that he's dressing as a peasant and helping poor Jews. And then he says he goes to heaven, if not higher, and he becomes a Hasid. So,
Rabbi, God willing, we'll get together. We'll be leading some of these people and others in Poland in the not too distant future. And when we do, we'll go to the Gensha Street Cemetery and we'll stand in front of the grave of Yud Lamed Peretz. And I will do a brief summary of that 1.5-page story of the Rabbi of Nemirov and the penitential prayer period. It's a great story.
Great story.
And I use it really as a jumping off point to tell about the Lithuania. But when I put this presentation together, it's not just me standing in the cemetery, but that graphic of putting them together. I had lots of fun and getting a lot of my friends very upset because I accused them, they are, of being Litvaks, and they were just unhappy with the very graphic description, which is 100% accurate. So.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. As usual, it was fantastic. I was riveted for every moment, and we will see you next week. And thank you, everyone.
God willing.
God
And I
willing.
love your comments and read. And I thank you, Rabbi, for telling me about that book when I grew up. Although I might have to get it on Kindle, but we'll see. Fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
We'll
Bye,
see you next
everyone.
week. Be healthy. Bye.